Well, good morning, Trinity friends, and welcome back to our Adult Forum series for this summer. We are exploring the life and times of David from the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel. We have covered a lot of ground over the past couple of months and several weeks, and I thought it might be a good chance now to kind of recap a little bit because we're coming to a pivotal moment in the life of David. So just to kind of refresh our memories, we started with David as a shepherd boy who takes the political military opportunity to defeat a military champion of the enemies of the Hebrews, the Philistines and Goliath, which then kind of gets him into, as a reward, the family and court of King Saul, where he's a musician and a military general or a warlord, more likely, and becomes very successful in his raids and his campaigns of violence against the enemies of the Hebrew people. He becomes something of a folk hero. People sing his praises. This, unfortunately, sparks the jealousy of the king at that time, King Saul. And King Saul seeks to take David's life. What complicates and frustrates Saul's efforts is that two of Saul's children, his son Jonathan and his daughter Michal, both dearly love David and go to great lengths to protect David, to run interference, to almost be a spy for David within their own father's court. And so David escapes many close calls with assassination attempts, but continues to garner the praise of the people. Eventually, it gets so bad that David runs away and joins the army of the enemies of the Hebrew people and the Philistines, and things are continue to be complicated in his life. Eventually, Saul finally falls completely and loses in battle and dies, and this is where we kind of have been the last couple of weeks, where David has the opportunity to ascend to greater power. Over the past couple of weeks, we've seen David become king over the full kingdom of the Hebrews, Judah and Israel. We've seen David bring the Ark of the Covenant back to Jerusalem and the capital city. And we've also seen David make a really terrible, awful, and evil mistake in his sexual assault of Bathsheba, and basically the assassination of her husband Uriah to cover up his deeds. And that kind of brings us to where we are today. And just a word about our content today. Things today are going to get real, as they say, and there will be some real conversation and real talk about these stories that include sexual violence. And other types of violence as well. So if that's a trigger for you, know that you can come back to this next week and skip this week if that's something that is troubling for you. But it is part of the story, so we do need to cover it, and we do need to kind of take a look at how this plays out in David's life, because his assault of Bathsheba, his sin against Bathsheba, is kind of the beginning of his tragic fall. And a lot of awful things begin to fall like dominoes in David's life from this point forward, according to the book of Samuel. We see his sin, his sexual violence against Bathsheba, kind of show up again in various ways. And you can really kind of track David's ascendancy to power and to the throne to this point with Bathsheba. And his kind of condemnation from the prophet Nathan, the prophet Nathan, about his actions. From that point, David really begins a tragic downfall that stretches beyond him and goes deeply into his home and into his children. So, as we know, during this time, it was not uncommon for kings to have multiple wives. David was no different, and so he had a number of children by these wives. And one of the issues that we see is that, it seems that at least in David's family, and because of David's action with Bathsheba, this kind of sexual violence is at least somewhat normalized, at least somewhat a part of the fabric of their family history, and we see it come up again within the family itself, and this is a really tragic and awful moment for everybody involved in this family. Um, so essentially, you've got 3 or 4 children or relatives who are involved in an incident involving David's son Amnon and his daughter Tamar. They're half brothers and half sisters, and Tamar is described as a very beautiful young woman, and Amnon desires her. Um, and this, of course, is taboo in pretty much every culture. It's taboo in Scripture, and it just goes to show how far and how deep this kind of sexual violence seems to have reached in David's family's life. Because Amnon conspires with one of his cousins to get his half sister alone. He pretends to be sick so that his father David will send Tamar to him to caretake for him. And at that point, once Amnon sends away his servants and he's alone with his half sister, he assaults Tamar sexually. And against her will, she vocalizes in the midst of this moment. She says no. She tells her half brother no. She says this is not a thing that's to be done in Israel. It's evil. It's terrible, and it's awful. And of course, he commits this evil sin and deed anyway. And this, of course, leads to Tamar's brother Absalom becoming quite understandably incensed at what's happened to his sister. And King David heard about it, but he wouldn't punish his son Amnon. And because of that, Absalom seems to have developed some antipathy towards his father David. Understandably so, of course. It says in 2 Samuel 13, verse 21, when King David heard of all these things, he became very angry, but he would not punish his son Amnon because he loved him, for he was his firstborn. But Absalom spoke to Amnon neither good nor bad, for Absalom hated Amnon because of what he had done to his sister Tamar. And what we then see is we see Absalom taking vengeance against Amnon, his half-brother, for what he had done to Tamar. And so we see this happening in chapter 13, at the end of chapter 13, where the servants of Absalom rise up and kill Amnon. And this, of course, upsets David, and as we've seen in other instances, whenever someone David loves is killed, whoever brings that news tends to be at risk of being killed themselves. So Absalom flees. He flees and attempts to escape what he assumes will be his father's wrath, and he stays for 3 years away. Eventually, he does come back. And eventually he and his father, over the course of the next few chapters, go to war with each other over the throne. And Absalom is victorious. David flees from Jerusalem. You begin to see this violence that began with David and his sexual assault of Bathsheba, carried on in his oldest son of Amnon against his daughter Tamar. And then his son Absalom avenging that loss, and then them going to war with each other. So we see this real tragic downfall of David based on his own sin, his own evil deed, kind of the consequences of his actions coming home to roost. And they go out and they are at war with one another, father against son, as they try to claim the throne for one another. Eventually, Absalom is defeated. David's son is defeated and is killed. And when that news comes to David, of course, David, as he has done in the past, becomes upset and actually winds up killing the people who bring him that news. Now, what's interesting here is this is a family that's been torn asunder. Absalom has become an enemy of the soldiers of King David. Yet David still mourns the death of Absalom and mourns it deeply. Mourns so much that it begins to upset his people. You may have heard this reference, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom," David cries out. "Would I had died instead of you, O Absalom, my son, my son." This kind of really profound and deep mourning. We really see David's regret and he's realizing how deep this tragedy has gone into his life. But his generals and his advisors begin to tell him that his deep mourning of Absalom, his son, who was an enemy, whom his people had fought for so long, his deep mourning and honoring of Absalom is threatening his own grip on his own people. They're beginning to resent him because he didn't mourn the death of his own soldiers as much as he's mourning the death of his enemy and his son Absalom. And so we see this kind of moment where David is emotionally crushed. We see how profound his loss has become as a consequence of his actions. It's this deep and steep fall where the moment he had achieved the kind of the zenith of his power, the zenith of his kingship, where he has ascended to the throne of Judah and Israel. He's united the people. He's returned the Ark of the Covenant back to Jerusalem. Everyone is singing his praises. With that power, he then assaults Bathsheba and assassinates her husband. And because of this, he has this steep fall within his family where those sins are kind of repeated. And that tragedy is repeated in his own family to the point where his own son wars against him and then dies. And what we begin to see as we look back on the life of David, one of the themes that emerges is not just that God was faithful in God's covenant with David in spite of the evil and in spite of his sins, that God's love and covenant isn't based on our goodness. But another theme that we also see is the cost that came with David's ascendancy to the throne, and how frequently that cost came at the hands of his family, most particularly of the women, whether his daughters or his wives. If you read through the scriptures, if you read through his story of 1st and 2nd Samuel, you'll see just how many wives David amassed during his time and during his conquering. And many of these women were the spoils of war for him. So a list of them can be found in a number of different works. But you had Michal, you had Abigail, Ahinoam, Maacah, Haggith, Abital, Eglah, Bathsheba, all of Saul's former wives, once he ascends to the throne as well. Abishag, and a number of other wives taken in Jerusalem, the mothers of folks he had defeated. And so we see kind of the trail of trauma that comes behind someone as powerful as somebody like David and these women. And I feel like it's important to actually talk about this and to admit how profoundly wrong this was, because in our own world, violence against women is still endemic. The statistics about those who've been abused, either physically, sexually, or emotionally, is shocking. And it happens across socioeconomics, across all demographics. The victimization of women is not an uncommon theme in our world today. And so I want to be clear that, you know, God blessing David in his life does not condone these actions and these sins. And in some ways, this became moments, especially his sin against Bathsheba, became kind of a pivotal moment where David really falls, and we see his decline, his precipitous decline, and the fracturing of his family. And it's hard to feel sorry for David. You look at his family and you see the brokenness, and you do feel sorrow and empathy for all the suffering that they've experienced. But um, it's hard when you hear David mourning Absalom to trust that mourning, to see it as genuine, because so much of it came from his own actions and from his own inactions, his inability to take action against his son who had assaulted his daughter. And so this whole picture of David really presents a deeply, deeply flawed person. And that's putting it mildly in a way. And so I think one of the things that we wrestle with as Christians, especially as modern Christians, is what to do with David and the central place he operates in the Jewish and Christian faith in his incredibly troubling life. There's something there's something comforting to know that, as we said last week, that this isn't a hagiography of David, that we get David and his warts and all, that we see both his triumphs and his profound flaws and tragedy. But still, we have to kind of wrestle with the central place he plays. Many of the Psalms are attributed to him. Now, scholars assume that most of those Psalms actually weren't written by David, but nevertheless, our tradition has attributed those words to David. So something as simple as Psalm 51, which we use every Ash Wednesday to open up the liturgy for Ash Wednesday, is a psalm that is attributed to David, and it is attributed to that moment after his assault of Bathsheba. And even that psalm itself, set in that context by our tradition, presents us with such a ambiguous, if not problematic, way of thinking about what happened between David and Bathsheba. So if you read it in our Psalter on page 656 in the Book of Common Prayer, Psalm 51, have mercy on me, O God, according to your loving kindness and your great compassion. Blot out my offenses. Wash me through and through from my wickedness and cleanse me from my sins, for I know my transgressions and my sin is ever before me. And at this point, we're kind of with David. If we set it in the context of his assault of Bathsheba, we think, okay, at least he's seeing how profoundly awful what he's done is, and how there's no coming back from something this bad. But then he goes on to write, and these are words kind of put in David's mouth by our tradition: against you only have I sinned and done what is evil in your sight. It's a line that I think should call us up a little short, quite frankly, because it's not just against God that David has sinned. He's sinned against Bathsheba and Uriah, and as we see the consequences of that, he's sinned against his entire family. And so there's a sense here that while David is taking some responsibility, he still doesn't see the full import of what he does to Bathsheba. Doesn't see what he's done to her as a human being. He goes on to talk about his own wickedness, and to beg God to have a new heart, a clean heart. Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me. Cast me not away from your presence, and take not your Holy Spirit. Give me the joy of your saving help again, and sustain me with your bountiful spirit. It's a wonderful sentiment, and it's a wonderful prayer. There's something reassuring knowing that it comes from the mouth of a man who had become as wicked as David had, realizing the error of his ways and begging to be a new creation. I think that's not a bad place to leave it. To leave our time together with this kind of tragic fall of David, with his deep and profound repentance. This sense of knowing that he's done wrong, still wrestling with it, still not coming to terms with how deep and profound that evil is, and knowing what's going to happen over the next several years in his family. It rivals the great Greek tragedies, the great stories of Shakespeare, where we see a heroic individual, the hero of the story, have a tragic flaw that does violence or harm in the world, and does great violence and harm to himself and those around him. So David is aging now at this point as we come to a close here, and next week we'll finish up with David's last and final days, and then what happens afterwards, and we'll see Bathsheba come back into the story. We'll see kind of the rest of her story. So where we started today with the tragedy that and the sin that happened against her, we'll then see kind of that closing chapter and where Bathsheba ends up. So I hope you join us next week for our final installment. Thanks and God bless.